becomes Jesus, who actually went to weddings and evidently enjoyed it, and he was sociable. He spent a whole lot of times with sinners, of all things. And so they said he was too sociable. So here you got John that they characterize as being unsociable, and Jesus as being too sociable. And of course, what Jesus says, you can't be satisfied with anything. Y'all are not willing to take the sociable aspects of me and the unsociable, at least what you call it, of John, and realize that maybe you're looking for the wrong thing. Maybe your concepts are completely out of kilter with actually what John was supposed to be doing, as preparing the way for the Lord, making his path straight, and what the Lord was trying to do too. But on the heels of that here, notice in verse 20, he began to upbraid the cities wherein most of his mighty works were done. And he even tells us why that's the case. He says he upbraided them, he rebuked them, because they didn't repent. Now he's going to tell them there's a reason why they should have repented, but they did not do it. And notice what he says, beginning in verse 21. Woe unto thee, Chorazin, woe unto thee, Bethsaida, for if the mighty works which were done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. You see, our point that we want to be presenting, hopefully if we get the lesson up here, is that God knows the end from the beginning. And not only that, but from this example right here, God actually knows what would have taken place had circumstances been different in the past. Because that's what he's saying right here. Those who had the opportunity to see the miracles that Jesus performed, and not even including the power with which he spoke, nobody ever spoke like this. He spoke as one that had authority and not as one of the scribes. We read that, of course, in Matthew chapter 7 at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. But he also can tell us just exactly what have been the circumstances in the past if the conditions have been different. He says here that if it had been the case that Tyre and Sidon, two heathen cities that end up being destroyed, just as God prophesied they would be, if they had been privy to the evidence that Jesus provides for those of his day and these that he mentions here, they'd have repented. Now, how can Jesus say that? Well, the reason why he can say that, because he knows what would have occurred had circumstances been different. If the things that they are given the opportunity to see, if those heathen cities had seen the same thing, they would have drawn the proper conclusion that, hey, anybody that can do these miracles has to have a real connection to deity, and thus we need to pay attention to what they say. And what he says is if they had that evidence that these people of Jesus' day did, they would have repented a long time ago in sackcloth and ashes. In other words, it would have had the impact on those ancient cities that it should have had among those who were contemporaries of Jesus. And then he goes on and says as well in verse 23, and thou, Capernaum, which are exalted in the heavens, shall be brought down to hell or Hades. For if the mighty works which had been done in thee had been done in Sodom, it would have remained to this day. But I say unto you that it shall be more tolerable for the land of Sodom in the day of judgment than for thee. Now, while this is obviously not, our topic is not degrees of reward and punishment, but obviously that's what's implied right here. It'll be more tolerable. Well, if there's something that's more tolerable, it means of necessity there's such a thing as less tolerable. And the tolerable nature of God here is demonstrated in that if those people that lived in Sodom and Gomorrah, if they had seen the mighty works that Jesus did to his day, the people of his day, then they would not have been destroyed. They would have looked at the evidence and said, man, these fellas have to be from God because nobody can do these supernatural things except God be with them. Now, what's the problem with those of Jesus' day in these cities that he mentions, as well as with the elite leaders of the Jews? They saw the miracles that were performed. They heard the power with which Jesus spoke, but they reasoned something like this. If we accept that this man is speaking from God, and obviously he is because nobody can do what he's doing except God be with him, then that means we're going to have to change what we've been thinking. We're going to have to admit that we've been wrong. We're going to lose our job. we're going to have to start worshiping a whole different way. And we can't have that. So the courageous, those who were courageous in the city of Jerusalem, they said simply, let's beat them and tell them to be quiet talking about Jesus. They admitted a mighty miracle had been performed in the healing of the lame man, but they said, we can't go so far as the evidence would take us in concluding that, hey, this is a genuine miracle that has been performed. The only person who has the ability to perform a miracle has to have a connection to deity, but if we admit that, we'll have to change what we're presently thinking, and we'll lose our position in society. You know, sometimes I use the phrase, you heard of people wanting to save face, you know? But sadly, many times the saving of face ends up resulting in a loss of soul. And that, of course, is the direct result when people do not accept the truth and obey it. One of two things happens to an honest person who's confronted with the truth. One or two things. Either he accepts the truth and goes along with it, or he becomes dishonest. There's no other choice. It's one or the other. So when we have the truth, and the truth is the only thing that will make us free, then we need to hold on to it tightly. Did you never find it yet? I mean, I know I could, and if I could, anybody could. Did y'all not find it up there, guys? I mean, it was just last Sunday morning. There's like 70 slides. We'll keep on trying. We'll go a little bit further, go back to the book of Esther, because that's where we was going to end up anyhow. Back to the book of Esther, and you'll recall that as far as chronological arrangement is concerned, Esther is not where it ought to be, because it would be in the last of the book, the last of the Old Testament instead of way back over here in the last of the history books. But it is, of course, a history that we're going to demonstrate and see in dynamic detail how that God's providence is at work, and especially as the case here with her. Who can tell me anything about Esther that stands out in your mind as far as your understanding of the book of Esther is concerned? Who was Esther? All right, she was a Jewish woman, but as a Jewish woman, you would think that that would mean she was not in line to be any such thing as a queen of the Medo-Persian Empire. And yet her ethnicity is not even seen, and she's simply a good-looking little girl, and so she ends up being in the group of individuals chosen to take another woman's place, and that woman's place is of course, Vashti. And the beginning of that, we re-examining the, we're examining it. And of course, we gave the hint just a minute ago. What in the world is the Medo-Persian Empire? Why are we concerned about that? How did there ever become such a thing as a Medo-Persian Empire that fits, there you go, that fits into the category of our Old Testament history? So we went over this first part, so I'm going to skip right through it. But we're going to be in the book of Esther, so if you're in the book of Esther, then stay right there and we'll be here in a minute. We've talked about how that this subject, of course, is a subject that is debated, and many more misunderstandings are attached to the concept of the providence of God than the truth is. And so we looked at Calvinism, and this is all available online. I guarantee you can go online and find it. But this is all that we looked at last week, showing that this is not something that is understood as proper. Now, here's a particular example. In Catholicism, when it comes to what God knows and what God does, here's what Catholicism says. It says that God directs the affairs of the world, not through the Word, but through the Roman Catholic Church. And so when you have different colored smoke coming out of the the top of smokestacks in the Vatican City, and it turns from blue to red, to orange to green, or whatever. That's because God is messing with the smoke colors. And the fellow who happens to be the so-called Pope right now is the guy that God chose. Now, we could logically and reasonably and rationally blow that out of the water with just a few passages of Scripture show the liberal mess that he's leading is not anything close to what the Bible teaches, and we wouldn't expect that because the Catholic Church is not the church of the Bible. When it comes to the ecumenical views of Roman Catholicism, here's a church that claims to be the church that Jesus established, and yet they see a way for salvation for those who deny that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. If you're a practicing Jew believing that Jesus was an impostor, then according to the Pope of Rome and the Roman Catholic Church on the left-leaning side, they'll say, well, of course, people can be saved as Jews. Even though Jesus said, if you believe not that I am he, you'll die in your sins. According to Catholicism, Jesus didn't know what he's talking about. And that would go for Islam too. That says that Jesus was a good man. He was a prophet, but he was not the prophet. The prophet, of course, according to them, is Muhammad, and the Quran is the Word of God according to Islam. So that ecumenical view, who do Catholics blame that concept on? They blame it on God. Because if they really do believe that the Roman Catholic Church and all of the tentacles of Roman Catholicism makes decisions because God is directing, then you can't go against that without going against God. Now, the problem with that is it's false, and we'll show that to be the case. We've even used the example of Billy Graham. Here's a quotation from him. One of the Bible's most comforting promises is that when we face major decisions, he will guide us by giving us an inner conviction and inner voice. And I used the example last week where in a month's time, when we were living on Hill Circle, I studied with a Jehovah's Witness, a Seventh-day Adventist, and a Mormon, all in a month's time. And all three of those groups, and the guys that was on my porch and then in my house talking about it, they all said that if you have a problem with our teaching jiving with the Word of God, then what you need to do is pray about it. And God will lead you to draw the proper conclusion. Now, I reckon how many times they've said that and sort of took it for granted that if they were teaching that the writings of Joseph Smith were inspired, do you think that anybody in comparing the Bible with the writings of Joseph Smith would end up saying, well, I'm going with the Bible and the Church of the Bible instead of the writings of Joseph Smith and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? Well, of course not. Is that the way God directs us? Through feelings? See, those three groups don't agree with each other, but they agree with each other that the Bible isn't sufficient, when the Bible says it is sufficient. So here we've got a choice. Are we going to accept what the Bible says about itself? Or are we going to take what these imposters say about their so-called inspired books? So that's an obvious misunderstanding as well. We're not denying there were miracles that took place in the Bible. We're not denying that God answers prayer. We know that's the case. And we are not denying either, or we are saying that we cannot say, I know that this situation that transpired was directly providence from God in making it happen. Now, most of the time, we can look back on it and say, you know, I think I can see God's hand in that. Yeah. But you cannot make a statement that you know that that was God's hand in it, the circumstances turn. And so many times when people make that affirmation, it don't take very many months at all till they look back and say, whoops, I was wrong. God didn't have anything to do with that. That was decisions that were made by other people that turned out the way it worked out. So we'll look at the example, is God working in the world? Well, that's a question that you can answer only one or two ways. Either he is or he isn't. We looked at the beginning of this that we skipped over concerning the deist position that was supposedly a part of the religious background of some of our founding fathers who believed that God created the world and all that's in it, and he just sort of sent it a spinning like a top, and he's hands off from now on. That's the deist position. Well, that's not correct. I mean, when you take that position, then you're going to end up being tied up in knots because all the futility of life is going to be attributable to God not caring. He doesn't have anything to do with us. He just created us and left us here to our own devices, and he gave us his word, and now Nothing he does has any bearing whatsoever on us. And a passage like this simply cannot be explained if you take the disposition. Now, Paul would say, we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. Notice he said, I have a knowledge claim here that I'm making, and I know it's the case, that all things work together for good. He's not saying everything's good, but everything works together for good. Sometimes those things that work together for good takes many years to take place. But they do ultimately come together for good. And why is this important? And this is basically the reason why we need to study this. When you have a false view of providence, you're going to end up in one of these positions. You're going to either be fatalistic in your view of things. Case say raw, say raw. Whatever will be, will be. I can still hear Doris Day singing that, can't you? Some of you are older. Well, that was the show that she was on. Fatalism would say that if I'm going to be killed, then nothing I can do to keep myself from being killed. And if it's my time to go, it don't matter if I'm sitting in my house with my headphones on, listening to music, then a bolt of lightning will kill me. There's nothing I can do about it. Now, nobody really believes that, but they say it as if that's somehow a good way to look at what God does. Ultimately, as well, that would seem to indicate that people believe that everybody's going to be saved somehow, some way. And that ultimately, of course, it results in accusing God of being the author of confusion. God's not the author of confusion. He cannot be the author of confusion. And of course, ultimately, maybe this is where so many things ultimately rest. Anything that I can do to remove my own personal responsibility, that's what I want to do. Anything that I can do to take the onus off of me and put it on somebody else, even God, then that's what I want to do. And of course, that is the very basis for the totality of Calvinism. If God from all eternity chose certain ones to be saved and certain ones to be lost, and you cannot get in either category by your own volition, that's something God chose for you, then if you're lost, it ain't your fault anyhow. It's God's fault. Now, that people can believe such as that is just mind-boggling to me, that it's God's fault if I'm lost. That's not the case at all. And here's the correct view, and this is obviously where we want to end up. Is God the God of all comfort? Well, sure he is. He provides us comfort, but he don't do that if you take these other positions. Do we have genuine hope? That is, desire with expectation. Well, sure we do. If we have a true concept of providence, consolation, motivation, assurance, the very things that Joel brought out in his lesson a few minutes ago. You know, we have the hope of heaven. And without an understanding, a correct understanding of providence, then that really doesn't mean much at all. So here's the evidence we want to look at. And if you notice, this is just a sampling. These are just a few people who just walked through the Bible. If you look at any of these guys or gals, and you see the life they lived, then you see points of providence at work in their lives all along. Many times, like in the book of Esther, you don't see the word God, you don't see the name of God anywhere in the book of Esther. And yet, throughout the book, you see almost on every page, in every verse, God's providence at work. And here's what our attitude should be when we have a correct understanding of providence. I can say this. I am only one, but still I'm one. I can't do everything, but I can do something. Even though I can't do everything, I'm not going to fail to do what I have the ability to do. Now, that should be the attitude of everybody. And since everybody in the whole wide world ought to be a Christian, that ought to be the attitude that all of us possess as well. So let's look at the background real quick. We started a few minutes ago in the first chapter of the book of Esther. Ahasuerus is a king. He's thrown a big party. It's a feast. It's a drinking party. And so there's a bunch of drinking going on. And when he's shown everything in his kingdom and sort of trying to impress all of his visiting dignitaries and drinking buddies, then he calls for his wife, who is the queen, Vashti, to come and to show her beauty to all the people. You can imagine. He has to be drunk to ask such a dumb thing as that. And yet here's a queen now of the Medo-Persian Empire, and she has a biblical concept of modesty. Can you imagine that? Where'd that come from? Maybe it was by observation. Maybe it's through just a little bit of common sense reasoning. But obviously, she's not going to parade before a bunch of drunk men showing her beauty off. She wouldn't do it. Well, how did the king respond to that? Well, he kicked her out of being queen. He dismissed her from being queen. And he sent out a message to the whole Medo-Persian Empire. Every man is the boss in his own house. Okay? Now, he misses one. Now, that is a principle, a true biblical principle. But just because you're the boss in your own house does not mean that you can require individuals who are under your headship to doing those things that are sinful. He has limits to his authority over his house. And Vashti stood her ground. Now think about how courageous that had to be. Could you imagine somebody actually standing up to the president, maybe a wife, and saying, you are a despicable figure before, but you need to quit. You retire. Retire, get up, stop. But yet, that's exactly what Vashti did. And so they need a new queen, chapter 2. And they go through this long selection process, and Esther ends up becoming the queen. And of course, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, her ethnicity is unrevealed. Nobody knows that she's a Jew. She's, her coloring evidently and all is just like all the Medo-Persians. No telling how much DNA has been swapped around. But she actually is under the care of her uncle, Mordecai, who's her cousin, I think it is called uncle, but it's relative. And Mordecai is the guardian of this woman. And what Mordecai becomes aware of, and this will figure in later on in the narrative, he becomes aware of a plot that has been undertaken by two of the king's servants to kill him. So here's a coup that he gets wind of, and it ends up saving the life of Ahasuerus. And he tells Esther about that, and that's taken care of. The two guys are hanged, and is written in the book of the Chronicles of the King. So it's in the orders and in the history of the king. And during this period of time, in chapter 3, a man by the name of Haman, who evidently is a pretty good soldier, at least he wants to be observed as a pretty good soldier, as he's coming into the court of the king, then Mordecai refuses to bow before him, and he takes that as a personal slide on his behalf. And so it made Haman mad. Who's this fella here that he knows is a Jew by his clothing? Who knows how he knows it, but he knows he's a Jew. And so he, from that time on, said, how am I going to get rid of this guy and everybody that's associated with him? And he ends up going to the king and coming up with a way to get rid of it. So here's what he said. Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there's a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of the kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all people, neither keep they the king's laws, therefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those who have the charge of this business to bring it to the king's treasuries. So he's serious about this matter. He's going to pay big money to get rid of Mordecai and all the Jews. Now, reckon how many Jews there are in the Medo-Persian Empire? There's a whole lot. Because previously they were slaves and servants of the Babylonians. The Medo-Persians whooped the Babylonians, so they end up being a part of the booty that is taken by the Medo-Persian Empire. So there's a whole lot of Jews. And it just so happens that one of the most prominent of the Jews happens to be the queen. Uh-oh, what are we going to do here? Now notice the charge that's made by Naaman here, by Mordecai here. He says there's a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among all the people in the provinces and the kingdom. Is that a true statement? Absolutely. They're spread out everywhere. Okay? And then his second accusation is this, and their laws are diverse or different from all people. Is that a true statement? Sure it is. The Jews' law is not the Medo-Persian law. And of course, just as us today, if there was a deviation from civil law that made it a sin for the Jews living under Medo-Persian law to violate that, they had to violate the law. God's law comes before man's law. So that's a That's a true statement too. But then notice the last thing he said. They don't keep the king's laws. Well, that's a lie. You see? So 2/3 of the things that Mordecai says are accurate, but what he says last does away with other things because it's not. They do keep. You can't have a better subject than God's people. Whether you're a Jew living under the Medo-Persian Empire, a Jew living under the Babylonian Empire, a Christian living in the United States of America, or a Christian living in Saudi Arabia, it doesn't matter. You can't have a better citizen than a child of God. But the difference, of course, is that you cannot violate God's law to obey the laws of men. And most of the time, you don't have to. And so he says, I want to get rid of them. And so they took the orders that he had received from Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus used his signet ring to sign the decree, and letters were sent by messengers to all the king's provinces, and here's what the decree was. We're going to destroy, kill, and cause to perish all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, even on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to take spoil of them for a prey. So it's pretty cut and dry. Here's one day that we've selected. We've got all this money ready to pay people to do it, and you probably had some people who were raising their hands and said, I'll help do that because I want some of that silver. And so here it's going to take place. But is it going to take place? Well, let's see. And he said, so here Mordecai tells, and this is, of course, the first two charts that we had that we jumped over in chapter 4. In chapter 4, get verse 14, where Mordecai finds out about this. He knows that Haman is trying to get rid of him and all the Jews. And so he ends up going to his cousin, who is the queen, Esther, and says this, for if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And notice what he says here. He has an idea as to what might happen if she does not take advantage of her opportunity. Why does he say that? Why does he say that if you don't do something, somebody will?
He made a promise to Abraham and his descendants that the Messiah would come through them.
Okay. So it's much like the assurance that Abraham had when God told him to go and to offer his son, Isaac, as a burnt offering. He surmised, if I kill him, then he's going to be brought back to life because he's the son of promise. He ain't married and he ain't got no kids now, so he's not going to stay dead. And that's much like here, Mordecai says, listen, the Jews are not going to be completely annihilated. They cannot be wiped completely out. Somebody will step up and God will use them to preserve the nation of Israel. And who knows? Esther, it may be that this obscure and weird situation in which this foreigner ends up being the queen, maybe you're in this position because God put you in this position. And he asked that question for, who knows? You might be in this position for just such a time as this. So we're going to look at this passage in 3 points, which is a sermon. This is a long sermon. We're not supposed to get it done today anyhow. But first, we're going to look at the interest of God in this plan. We're going to look at how this plan is immutable. In other words, you cannot set it aside even if you wanted to. And it's an infallible plan because it's God's plan. And notice what he says. Who knows? Well, who does know? Who knows whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? There's only one person that does know. That's God. God knows. Now, Mordecai may think, as everything is sort of falling out here and you're in this position, I'm pretty sure. Now, I mean, if there was ever a case of providence and getting everything right in line to be able to fulfill the promises, this has got to be it. This is certainly what could happen, Esther. This may. But if you don't, then somebody's going to. And so when he asked the question, who knows, then obviously it's God that knows. From a human standpoint, it's always going to be the possibility. And that's where we have to stay as well. The possibility. Who knows? if I am here today for just this very reason? Who knows that? Well, God does. God knows it. Nothing, absolutely nothing in the scheme of redemption happened by accident. Just as Joel told us about the foolish notion that God did not realize the Jews were going to reject him, and so they had to come up with plan B. Had to come up, oh no, what are we going to do now? And so deity had to decide, well, what can we do as a substitute? Well, let's come up with a charge. And people buy that and swallow it as ridiculous and as blasphemous to the very name of God as that is, as to how in the world God could not know that the Jews were going to reject his son. Of course, all you got to do is read Isaiah chapter 53, and you see that God knew exactly what was going to happen to his son. Nothing happens by accident. Here's some examples to prove it. Revelation chapter 13, verse 8. We read about the Lamb that was slain from the foundation of the world. Who's that talking about? It's talking about Jesus, isn't it? Well, how was Jesus slain from the foundation of the world? It was foreknown. That was the plan whereby man would have the opportunity to be saved. That's the reason why we have all those examples throughout patriarchy, throughout the Mosaic age. All those examples was pointing us to the fact that Jesus is the Lamb. These were all antitypes of the type of Jesus in being slain from the foundation of the world. And then also, Joel quoted from this passage as well this morning, that the church and the eternal purpose of God was made known. It was an eternal purpose. Here's a plan that superseded the creation of mankind. How could God know that he was going to need a plan to save man? Because he knew what man would do when he was given the opportunity to exercise his free moral agency and do that which was wrong. That didn't catch God by. He said, oh no, what are we going to do now? I thought we was going to have the biggest Garden of Eden ever, and nobody's ever going to violate my will, and everybody's running around and not feeling shameful if they don't have no clothes on because they're innocent. That didn't happen. Did God know it wasn't going to happen? Well, of course he did. Sure he knew it was going to happen. That's the only way you can say that Jesus is the Lamb that was slain from the foundation of the world, or the church is part of God's eternal purpose, his eternal plan, which he purposed in Christ Jesus. I cannot believe the time frame. Secondly, we've got 3 minutes. Interest of God in the plan. Nothing ever catches God. Nothing ever has caught God by surprise. Nothing ever will catch God by surprise. Now, we can't say that. Even on our best days, we can't say that. We don't know what's going to happen from one minute to the next. And once we think we've all got it all figured out, then something will come up and surprise us tremendously. Imagine 2019. I had 2 surgeries that year, one in January and one in December. Mom and Daddy died. And those were the better things that happened. That's a terrible year. And I said, there'll never be another year like this, and this is as bad as it gets. And then came COVID. You don't know. You can't say something. It'll never get worse than this because you don't know what's going to happen. And, of course, the plan that's initiated with the first messianic promise in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, right on the heels of the rebellion of Adam and Eve, then God said he was going to bruise the head of the serpent, which is Satan, and there would be a minor blow sustained by the Son of God, and that he's being crucified on the cross. But that doesn't stop anything. The plan still continues. We'll have to pick up right here, Lord willing, next Sunday morning. Thank y'all so much.